Good afternoon and welcome to the New America Foundation. I'm David Gray and I direct the Workforce and Family Program here at New America, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this event, The Future of Work-Life Balance and Workplace Flexibility. On March 31st, the White House hosted a provocative forum on workplace flexibility in which President Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama talked about their own struggles with work-life balance and the need for action on the issue of workplace flexibility. This was a groundbreaking event in the world of work-life balance policy to have the two of them talk so passionately about this issue so prominently. But what is workplace flexibility? Why is it needed? Why does the President care about it? How did we get to the place of this White House forum? And most importantly, where do we go from here? And that's what today's conversation is about. We're fortunate to have a very strong panel of experts to help us think through these questions today. Full biographies are available outside along with our boxed lunches, so I won't read through them in their entirety, but let me introduce our speakers to you briefly. Over the past 15+ years, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation has supported important research that has helped surface for policymakers what you all in your own lives and what millions of Americans know from their own experiences, that there is a mismatch between the needs of families for flexibility and the structure of American workplaces. And no one person has done more to surface this issue and draw attention to the need for workplace flexibility, which led to the March White House conference, than Dr. Kathleen Christensen. Kathleen is the director of the Workplace, Workforce, and Working Families program at the Sloan Foundation. Along with Barbara Schneider, who is on travel and unable to be with us today, Kathleen is the co-editor of a new book, Workplace Flexibility, Realigning 20th Century Jobs for the 21st Century Workforce, which is on sale out here today. We are grateful to your support and to your leadership on this important field and issue, Kathleen, and for your being here today. Thank you. After Kathleen speaks, we'll hear from Mike Aiken, who is the Director of Governmental Affairs at the Society for Human Resource Management. I appreciated working with Mike when I was at the Department of Labor, where I saw his thoughtful approach to business and policy issues. Then we'll hear from Heather Boucher, who is a senior economist at the Center for American Progress. Among her many accomplishments, Heather is the co-author of the Shriver Report, A Women's Nation Changes Everything, a groundbreaking study published last fall that has drawn new attention to this policy space. And then we'll hear from Katie Corrigan, the Director of Workplace Flexibility 2010 at Georgetown Law. Katie and her team have helped develop bipartisan working groups within Congress and beyond that have created the most significant dialogue on business labor issues that I've seen in many years in Washington. And then following Katie's remarks, I'll open the floor to your questions and your comments. And given the expertise of the people we have gathered in the audience today, we look forward to a lively conversation. So thank you to all of our featured speakers and to all of you for being here. We appreciate as well the many people who are watching this event live as we broadcast it over the internet. And so we'll begin with Dr. Kathleen Christensen. Kathleen?
Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here. And I see many old, familiar faces, not old, but familiar faces in the audience, and many new ones too. So I look forward to our conversation after the presentations. David really gave the headlines of what I want to talk about today, which is really to provide kind of the background, and then my fellow panelists will also talk about the steps from where do we go. But I want to frame the issues. Why is there a need for workplace flexibility, and how did we come to that as a possible solution for what are many of the issues that American families at all ages and stages in life are facing? In the late 20th century, as we all know because we lived through it, there were major social and economic changes in our society. Most dramatically, it was the entrance of women into the labor force, not just entering the labor force, but staying in the labor force. And nowhere was this seen more dramatically than in the incidence of labor force participation rates of working mothers. Now, by 2010, 50% of the American workforce is comprised of women for a variety of reasons, not and in part also due to the Great Recession that we're in now. The entrance of women into the labor force has also then given rise to dual earner, single parent, and single earner households. And in fact, if we look at the figures from 1965 to 2005, I'm going to try and turn sideways a bit, the percentage of two-parent households that are dual earner has virtually doubled. In 1965, there's about 28% of all two-parent households were dual earner, and by 2005, it was nearly 58%. Although there's been a slight dip, it's again back on the rise. What this has meant is that children are now more apt to be living in households in which all parents are working full-time. And again, that has seen tremendous growth since 1968. In 1968, 25% of children, American children, were living in households in which their parents were all working. And by that, I'm including those living in households with two parents and those living in households with single parents. And by 2008, that number had again doubled to 48%. And two other trends that can't be ignored is the aging of the population. People are living longer, and a significant proportion are, in fact, living healthier lives for longer periods. But just the sheer nature of the fact that people are living longer has also given rise to greater responsibilities for elder care. And in fact, some figures indicate that 1 out of 5 of all American employees in fact, are now caring for a relative over the age of 50. So that's 20% of the workforce has some kind of elder care responsibility. And then coupled with that is the rising costs of essential goods. Since the early mid-1970s, the costs of 3 essential goods, housing, health care, and education, have gone up exorbitantly. And so for whatever reasons women may have also wanted to work, there was also a strong economic need that women had to work beginning in the mid to late 70s. So in the mid-1990s, I was approached by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to take a look at what was happening, because even though we were living through this political, economic, and social sea change, no one was really studying this in terms of any kind of scholarship. Businesses were beginning to recognize it, but in terms of really deeply understanding what was happening to the American family, there was really no scholarly understanding. So I was asked to start a program that would really look at the two-earner, primarily the dual-earner households, but also the single-parent, single-earner household, to understand what was happening within the families, what was happening within the workforces where the parents in these households were working, and then also what could be done to address the needs. Out of that 15 years of work has come the edited volume that David mentions, which is Workplace Flexibility, Realigning 20th Century Jobs to a 21st Century Workforce. So what I'm going to be talking about today draws on the research and the projects that Sloan has supported over the last 15 years, and much of that is represented in this volume. Over 15 years, we have supported 350 grants and about $120 million to address this major societal shift, to understand it and to figure out what can be done. At the root of when we began the research and really began to look at what was happening, what was very clear is what we were dealing with was the changing arithmetic of the family. We can talk about the statistics, but really I think we have to come to the core issue that the arithmetic of the family has changed. And by that I mean, in a traditional family, which is now in the minority, there are 2 jobs and 2 adults. One job is breadwinning, one job is homemaking. So the ratio of job to adults is imbalanced. It's 1 job to 1 adult. The demands are really in balance with the resources. However, in the last quarter of the 20th century and now at the beginning of the 21st century, we have a 3-job, 2-adult family. So there are 2 breadwinning jobs and 1 homemaking job, but still only 2 adults. And this cuts across all income groups. And the result is a ratio, even if there is complete gender equity within families, and I would say that probably in most families there's not complete gender equity. If there's complete gender equity, there's 1.5 jobs per adult. So the demands really outstrip the resources. So what we're looking at is a structural problem. This, there is a gender component to it, there's no question. But the fact is, even if there is gender equity, there would still be a structural overload. And this is with regard to dual earner families. Single parent, single earner families have even a more difficult time. Because if these are 3 jobs, 2 adults, those may be 2 jobs, 1 adult, 3 jobs, 1 adult. So as a single parent, single earner family even has a more difficult time, and the ratio becomes even more out of kilter. So the results of these demographic changes and the changing arithmetic of the family is that we have a very different workforce at the beginning of the 21st century. The workforce is as apt to be female as well as male. With the aging of the workforce, it's as apt to be older as well, younger as well as older. It's a dual-focused workforce, which means that when someone shows up at work, they're not just showing up at work. In the back of their mind, they've got a million other things they're also responsible for. And this holds for men as well as women. And in effect, this dual-focused workforce has paid work crowding out much of their life. And we can see this just by comparing figures from 1960 to 2000. In 1960, the average hours of paid work per household, not per individual, but per household, was 44 hours because the predominant model was a single earner household. Now, in 2000, the average number of paid hours is 80 hours because there are 2 earners in that household. So when you look at the household as the unit responsible for getting everything done, the amount of paid work per household has virtually doubled. But this 21st century workforce is operating in a 20th century workplace. And it's a workplace that can be characterized in many ways, and we could talk about the legal infrastructure for it and the policy infrastructure for it, but I just want to talk about its organization in time and space. It's a workplace that has really been defined as work being done year in and year out, work being done on a full-time, full-year basis, with little to no time off for personal or family reasons, that the career paths are rigid and linear. People get on in their 20s, they get off in their 60s, and then retirement occurs at 65. But the reality is there's a mismatch. You've got a workforce that's changed dramatically, and you've got a workplace that really has not changed. And there's a cost to that mismatch. And if we just look at the costs with regard to the families, we can see, first of all, that there's a real time famine. And I mentioned that before when I said paid work crowds out the rest of life. But there is a time famine, and people just feel that they don't have enough time to do everything that needs to be done, and needs to be done well or just needs to be done. We can see this in some of the time use work that's been done by Suzanne Bianchi and her colleagues. And I don't know if you can read this, but this was based on time diaries and how people were using their time. And basically, for men and women, because of varying distributions of time over paid work and childcare and housework, each are working, if they're working full-time, are each working about 78 to 80 hours a week between paid and unpaid time. The mothers are the darker bar, and the fathers are the lighter bar, and both are saying there's too little time for self. They're multitasking. Women particularly are saying they're multitasking most of the time. Nearly 70% of both mothers and fathers say too little time for spouses. Over half of the mothers say they always feel rushed. And interestingly, it's the fathers who are more apt than the mothers to feel that there's too little time for their youngest child. And this actually corresponds with some recent research that Families and Work has done that has shown that for the first time, men are reporting higher levels of work-family conflict than are women. And it appears to be that women have kind of reached the saturation point of conflict, and that men are on the rise because they're for not the first time, but for an increasing amount of time, they are assuming more responsibility and feeling as a result more of the conflict. So, as I said, the result of having a finite amount of time and a rigid workplace is that people are multitasking much more. Women are multitasking more than men. And the mothers are in the graph at the top, and the fathers are at the bottom. But both, and this is a percentage of beeps, and that's a type of method that my colleague Barbara Schneider and her colleague Shira Offer used. It's called ESM. It's a method that basically people wear wristwatch. They're beeped throughout the day, over the course of the day, the course of a week and longer. They're asked to write down what they're doing, with whom are they doing it, and how they feel about it. And in terms of the percent of beeps, both men and women are multitasking virtually 50% or more of their time. Women are doing it almost 60% of their time. You can see that the peak time for multitasking, let's see, is about 8 o'clock at night after work. Between 6 and 8, it starts really rising. It's what my mother used to always call the witching hours, if you have young kids. And the result of that is that and I'll get to this slide in a minute, is that, and I don't have a slide on this point, but the fact is that mothers who have increased multitasking also report increased levels of irritation, increased levels of stress. They also report better satisfaction with work-life balance, because in many cases, and it gets to this point, mothers are, mothers are more apt to be doing the multitasking when they're doing housework and something else. So mothers are more apt to be doing multitasking when they're doing housework and spending time with their children usually. Fathers are more apt to be doing, see, this is the father bar. Fathers are more apt to be doing multitasking when they're doing work and work. So as a result, the mothers are doing the multitasking more more in terms of housework and family work, and that could be even occurring at the workplace, but it's more apt to be occurring at home. Another cost to families of having this rigid workplace is a disruption to family rituals. You know, there's a lot of emphasis, and I've been doing it myself, in terms of what are the effects on people's use of time and their feelings about time. But I think that ignores a very basic issue, which is that for many parents, and I would say probably more mothers than fathers, what they really see as one of their primary roles in the family is as a meaning maker. Someone who really is the person responsible for the rituals. So if you have a household in which it's 1.5 jobs per person, how are you going to bring that ratio down to closer to 1-to-1? One, if you have the resources, which certainly all households don't, you begin to pay for services. But the other is that you want to reclaim some of your time so that you can do it yourself. Now, an example of this is You know, if it's your child's birthday party, many people want to plan it themselves. They don't want to pay for someone to do it. If it's the holidays, you want to have the family dinner. But one of the major sources of stress in many people's lives is when there is a big family ritual coming up and you just don't feel that you have enough time to do it. And it is an issue of time, but often it is more an issue that this is the making of the meaning in the family, and people just don't feel that they are able to do it in the way that they want to do it. Also, some research that we have funded at UCLA, and this is also in the book, looked at dinner time, and they found that only 1 in 5 families have dinner consistently over the course of the week. And what is interesting about the research that UCLA Center on Everyday Lives of Families does is they do video ethnographies. So their methodology is not asking people what they do. They actually have gone in and filmed what families are doing from the moment they get up in the morning to the time they go to bed. And what they found is that only 1 in 5 actually have dinner together. And even of those who say they have dinner together, it's not what we really think of as the Norman Rockwell dinner. Instead, what happens in many cases is it's dinner, but one person comes in at one time, one person eats a meal in another room, one person leaves earlier than the others. So it's like a movable feast. It's not a dinner where everyone sits down at one time, eats at one time, and leaves at one time. Okay, so let me just move ahead. There's also costs to business of this mismatch. One, if people don't have the opportunity to be able to have some flexibility, then they may take off a full day as opposed to being able to come in a little bit late if they have a doctor's appointment for their child. Particularly with low-income workers, if they're late, they oftentimes they face a higher risk of being fired, and with that comes the cost of turnover. And also research that we funded has found that even within when people do not feel that they have the flexibility to even call their families at 3 o'clock when the kids get out of school, that performance at the workplace begins to suffer, and that's been able to be measured. So there is no perfect solution, but what people kept telling us over and over again is that what they needed and they wanted was more workplace flexibility. They wanted more control and predictability over how, when, and where they worked. And by that, flexibility really is a means by which we can restructure, realign the structure of the workplace to the needs of a diverse workforce. But there's a flexibility gap. 80% of people indicate that they want flexibility, but in terms of flexible work arrangements, the maximum percentage that have it is about 33%. And that's only if they can periodically start and change their times of work. If it goes to daily being able to start and change if they want to daily change their start and stop times, it drops down to 13%. Let's say, you're running late, well, I'll just go in a little bit later. Then the percentage who have that option is 13%. Compressed work weeks where you work a full-time week in 4 days, for example, as opposed to 5 days, is only 10% of the workforce that has this. And then telework or flex place, only 3% have it, whether or not it's on a regular or an occasional basis. So in 2003, at the foundation, I felt that what we really needed to do was just to establish a national initiative that would really address this issue of workplace flexibility. And the goals of this initiative, which is a collaborative initiative of about 20 grantees, Georgetown's Workplace Flexibility 2010, New America, the Twigga Foundation, AARP, a number of organizations have been involved with this initiative. And the goals have been to make workplace flexibility a compelling national issue and a standard of the American workplace. The strategies have been to increase voluntary employer adoption, but also to work towards bipartisan support in Washington. And this is what certainly Katie Corrigan from Workplace Flexibility can talk about in terms of what Workplace Flexibility 2010 has done. And also to really change the media coverage. Up until this point, flexibility was seen as a woman's issue, and as the president, I think, very clearly said on March 31st, it is not just a woman's issue. And and also to change it from being seen just as a perk or a benefit, but as to a strategic business tool. And I think one of the most important things that the grantees, the members of this initiative did was lay out the principles for the national initiative. And the first principle was that flexibility has to be proportionately fair to both employers and employees. And it has to be equally available to hourly and salaried workers, and must be equally available to employees across the life course. This is not a set of arrangements that are just available to people early in their careers with young children. Workplace flexibility has really broadened the notion of flexibility and talks about three kinds of flexibility. Flexible work arrangements, which really has to do with the daily kind of flexibility. Time off, which has to do with short-term time off. Episodic time off, a recurring kind of time off, and then extended time off, longer-term time off, and then career flexibility, the ability to have multiple points of exit, re-entry, and as well as maintenance during the time that one is out of the labor force. And this again is also not just a woman's issue. This has to deal also with the American military. We supported a number of projects that really examined the data from businesses, and these are a number of the businesses that allowed previously proprietary data to be made available to corporate voices. And the data basically showed that there was a business case to be made for workplace flexibility, that it was a strategic business tool. What was shown through this research is that flexibility, when properly designed and implemented, can shorten cycle times, it can increase productivity, it can improve employee engagement, and it can lower turnover and absenteeism. It's also good for employees. I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to go into detail, but in the Q&A, if people are interested, I can talk a little bit more about this. We have seen that even the availability of flexibility can result in healthy behaviors in terms of exercise, regular doctor checkups, etc. It can reduce stress. People have more control over their time and timing of work. It increases more family time. It increases also the possibility of community time through volunteerism, and it enables many workers to stay employed who otherwise might not, including the disabled workers, older workers who would perhaps only work if they could work on a part-time or part-year basis. In addition, through the efforts led by Georgetown Workplace Flexibility 2010 and also through the efforts of New America working with Georgetown, there's been a major effort in Washington to really address the issue of workplace flexibility. As one example, in the 2008 presidential elections, both Obama as a candidate and John McCain as a candidate endorsed workplace flexibility. So that there is an emerging sense of bipartisanship, and that has also occurred through the efforts of Georgetown on the Hill in a number of different ways. Multiple stakeholders are engaged, and it appears that there is consensus emerging. And as David said, on March 31st, there was the Forum on Workplace Flexibility. Even though we have been living with these issues as a society, this was really, I would say, the first time that we had this kind of high-level spotlight put on the issues that American families are facing. And out of that has come a greater attention to the way that workplace flexibility can improve lives, can support businesses, and can strengthen the economy. What it's also doing is changing the conversation from it having been a woman's issue to being a strategic business tool that suits the needs of both business and employees. But it doesn't get us to where we have to be. There's still so much more work that needs to be done, and needs to be done within and across a variety of arenas. And that's what my colleagues are going to talk about today. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. That does give just a great focus on the need for workplace flexibility. And I appreciated especially Kathleen's depiction of some of the family's dinner hours. As a parent of a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old, I can totally take all that chaotic description to heart. As Kathleen ended by saying, and as we focus now, the question with all this attention and the clear, compelling need for action is where do we go from here? What is being done and what should be done? And we're first going to hear from Mike Aiken from the Society for Human Resource Management. His group has taken this issue both from how the private sector and how businesses are using flexibility as a strategic tool, and also some creative roles potentially for policy in this arena in a way that's been very impressive to me. So I was glad Mike was able to take some time to be with us today. Mike?
Well, thank you, David. And I want to also thank Kathleen for her work and the work of the Sloan Foundation in just moving this issue forward. And I want to thank David and the New American Foundation for holding this program today. And you're going to hear I anticipate a lot of similar themes from most of us in terms about the importance of workplace flexibility and even some action steps. What was amazing to me, and Sherm participated in the President's Workplace Flexibility Program on March 31st, is that this issue has gained in so much importance to both employers and employees that the White House dedicated a whole day to that event. From our membership's perspective, and we represent about 250,000 HR professionals in for-profit and not-for-profit organizations who struggle with helping employees to balance their work and life obligations every day. One of the things that Kathleen mentioned, and I think is critically important to this discussion, is not to see it as just an issue only for women or only for individuals with young children. It is an issue that works its way through an individual's life cycle. We know that older employees need just as much of a work-life balance as younger employees, and I can personally attest that fathers struggle with the work-life issue. So why is this important to employers, and why are employers engaged in this? And again, Kathleen hit upon several of these items. We see it from a productivity and employee engagement standpoint. Employers are doing a lot of innovative things out there, certainly because employees have asked for it, but there's different dynamics at place right now that we are seeing employees struggle with this increasing challenge of balancing work and family, particularly as Kathleen pointed out, more individuals are working 2, sometimes 3 jobs. And what types of things are employers doing out there? Telecommuting, as Kathleen mentioned, is a very strong option that many employers are engaged in. Particularly, we see in major metropolitan areas such as Washington, D.C. and New York. And it's not available to every employer or not ever available to every employee. And it could be on a full-time basis or it could be on a sporadic basis. But that's one of the policies that we see employers are engaging in quite a bit. Another one is what's known as a paid time off arrangement, which is relatively new within the construct of the work site, in which employees are given a block of time to use how they see fit, without the employer asking, is this sick leave, is this vacation leave, why are you taking time off? But letting employees manage their leave allotments in the best way they see fit to make their work life needs met. Flexible work arrangements, and these run the gambit to where an individual may have a schedule that they start a little bit later in a particular day and end a little bit later in the day, maybe missing a rush hour or sharing life obligations with a partner or a spouse in terms of daycare responsibilities and the like. And again, those can be on a sporadic or occasional basis. It could also be a situation where the employer and employee have an agreement where, as the need arises, they're allowed to change their schedule to meet that particular family obligation. Compressed work weeks, and this is actually a concept that's been around for quite some time, typically in the public sector, where an employee will work a 40-hour work week as opposed to over 5 days within a 4-day time cycle. last 18 months, as we saw gas prices go up, a lot of state and localities turned to actually using compressed work weeks to try and provide a little bit of more flexibility to employees, but also to respond to the employees' needs about the high cost of transportation and some of the other cost issues associated with that. Results-oriented work environments, or ROE, which is a new concept that was actually created through Best Buy, which is a retail operation, not typically what you would think to be on the cutting edge of workplace flexibility. But what it was around and what Best Buy has successfully done is where the participants themselves figure out how do we get the work done and when do we get the work done in a team-oriented approach. Job sharing of positions in which individuals actually share a full-time job. The insurance industry actually partnered and created a lot of these opportunities back in the 80s and 90s as a way to try and handle the ebb and flow of the insurance market, but it allowed them to have individuals be able to participate in a professional capacity, but within the structures and confines of the needs of the employer. Now, as I mentioned, employers are doing these types of benefits and policies not only because they have employees asking for them, but employers see when you go to these innovative and creative approaches to promote flexibility and focus on output and results, not on hours worked, not on face time, productivity rises, turnover declines, and employee engagement and morale improves. Those are very bottom-line reasons why employers agree and want to participate in these types of arrangements. We've also seen, and Kathleen discussed this a little bit, a stronger employer interest in engaging in an overall discussion about how do we increase work-life flexibility, not just have the conversation in Washington, but really in the trenches out there at the work sites. And we've seen the great work that Sloan has funded through the Families and Work Institute with and the Twigga Foundation of When Work Works, where they're actually doing pilot programs in, I believe it's 8 locations around the United States to come together as a community to create a work-life issue, not just from the employer perspective, but from the government's perspective as well, state and local government working to try and address these issues. We have the great work of the Georgetown 2010 project as well, where they've brought a group of us together from both the employer community and the advocate community to actually sit down and talk about some of these very difficult issues. And having only worked in Washington about 20 years, there aren't too many more difficult issues to talk about than when you start talking about the working conditions and laws governing the workplace for both employers and employees. Now, as David mentioned, we rolled out last year, we tried to start a different conversation on the whole issue of work-life balance. SHRM has felt very strongly that when you look at kind of the entrenched perspective on workplace flexibility from both the employer and employee groups, on the one side, the employer community has been very reluctant for a variety of reasons to look at paid leave mandates as a potential solution to the work-life flexibility issue. And on the other hand, you have the advocate community that's pushed hard for them and have not always, I think, appreciated some of the challenges that employers have ran into in implementing these mandates. From us, we see that there's an opportunity to have a different kind of conversation and dialogue and to talk about what works for just employers and not what just works for employers and not just what works for employees, but what works for both. And if you look at some of the work that Sloan has funded and done, whether it's through the Families and Work Institute, Twigga, or the 2010 project, what you see at its core of a successful work-life program is what works for both. And not every environment always lends itself to the same type of an approach. What might work for an hourly employee may not work for an exempt employee. What may work in a manufacturing environment may not work at a hospital. What works in a unionized environment may not work in a non-unionized environment. So if you really take it to the core, workplace flexibility has to be flexible and be adaptable to that particular community and that organization. And that's what we've tried to do with one of our ideas and our proposals. And at its core, what we've essentially said is we believe, from SHRM's perspective, is that employers should be encouraged to provide paid leave and provide flexible work options. The key there is encouraged, and we think, and there's a lot of examples that I can point to, certainly in the questions and answer session of this, of federal employment law and even state law that allows or encourages employers to do good things when it comes to pensions, good things when it comes to health care plans, and provides incentives for employers to adopt those types of safe harbor approaches. And what employers would love is to engage in that kind of conversation about what would work from that perspective. Now, as you can imagine, and David mentioned, we kind of went out on a limb with this, and we've heard from both sides about what they like and what they don't like with this proposal. And you know, some of the employer community, quite frankly, have taken the approach that putting off the debate on this as long as they can is the most constructive approach they can do. Others in the advocate community have not quite trusted some of us in the employer community of coming up with a constructive dialogue as to how this works. But having said that, I think the proof has been in the pudding. SHRM has participated with, and other employer groups, with the Families and Work Institute, through the When Works Work program, as well as the 2010 project, in trying to have this conversation on Capitol Hill on flexible work arrangements, for example, and trying to see if there are ways in which, not only from a policy perspective at the work site these can work, but is there a common ground that can be reached around a policy address on work flexible arrangements to encourage more of those to be offered. Secondly, we just hosted, and several of the folks in the audience participated, a major conference back in March on global issues affecting the workplace. And one of the surprise issues that folks wanted to talk about was workplace flexibility. So what's happening here in the United States is not unique, and lots of other countries around the globe are starting to face this type of challenge. And in that kind of conversation, had a very thoughtful dialogue about the types of workplace flexibility policies that work best. Now, what are the next steps from this? I mean, from our perspective, when you look at some of the innovative things that are being done, and when I participated in the White House meeting, and you heard all the creativity that was going on around the table, companies such as Sara Lee and Best Buy, as I mentioned, and others, and talking about things like a row, like compressed work weeks, like flexible work arrangements. One of the challenges many of them told me they ran into was the fact that many of them violate one aspect of federal labor law or the like. In trying to be creative and innovative, they run smack dab into laws and regulations that had great intentions protecting employees in the work site, but may not fit the type of work that we're doing in the 21st century. So how do you keep those, how do you modify those laws and regulations to still provide the protections that are desperately needed for employees, but at the same time allow for flexibility and creativity? Things such as OSHA requirements as it applies to telecommuting arrangements at home. The National Labor Relations Act, which has this thing that says employers and employees aren't allowed to talk about working conditions in the work site because it could become in essence, an employer, a union aspect under the National Labor Relations Act. We have states now that are taxing employees, or trying to tax employees for telecommuting, and this has happened in the New Jersey and Connecticut area, taxing employees from working at home. So there's those types of issues that need to be addressed, and others in terms of trying to find a 21st century policy that fits a 21st century workforce. And so from our perspective, we're very interested in engaging in that type of activity. We look forward to the Q&A and in particular listening to my other colleagues on the panel. So thank you for inviting me again, and we look forward to the continued discussion.
Thanks very much, Mike. I so appreciated Heather's work on the Shriver Report last October and her many great articles on this piece, and we're pleased that she's taken time to be with us today. From the Center for American Progress, Heather Boucher.
Thank you, David. So I want to just start off by talking specifically about the event that happened at the White House, just a little bit more detail on that. So it was, in many ways, it's been so interesting to follow Kathleen and Mike on this panel and sort of hear both all the important work that Sloan has funded and that other folks have done that got us to this place. And the way that I saw this event on March 31st was really sort of the White House saying, okay, so there's been a lot of movement and talk on these issues, and they're trying to figure out sort of what their next steps are, how to engage, and how to push it forward. And it seemed to me that it was in some sense, it was sort of merely, and I use the little air quotes there, sort of making their mark that they think that this is a really important set of issues, and they're trying to figure out sort of what the next steps are and how to move forward. And so I want to sort of talk about some of the things that I thought were really great about the event, some of the things that I thought that we could do that little concerns or, little challenges. I don't want to say anything was bad about it because it was fantastic from beginning to end. There was nothing wrong with it. And then I want to just sort of provide a little bit of sort of other comments both on what's already been said and how I think we can move forward. So it seemed to me, on some level, that one of the best things about the event, and it's already been mentioned, and I'm glad that Kathleen brought this up, was that it was an event that the messaging was that this is not just about women. But this is about men and women and families. And I think that, as an economist who's sort of studied these issues for quite some time, I come to them from the perspective of what's happened to the well-being of America's families. And as Kathleen did those great charts on what's happened is that they've lost a lot of time at home because they're working a lot more. And part of the reason that she didn't talk about that they're working a lot more has been the long-term secular decline in men's wages. There's been a lot of, push of, a lot of things pulling women into the labor force, and all that is great. As you always speak to these audiences, all these fantastic professional women. We like the fact that women now get college degrees and work in the workplace, but there's also a downside to it, especially for low-income and middle-class families for whom women aren't in these fantastic careers but are working, and a lot of it is because they need that income to make ends meet, and that's a part of the long-term trajectory of what's happened to American labor. So it's great that we're not just talking about these as women's issues. And I want to give you two quotes from the event. These are sort of my two favorites. One, they're both from President Obama, and I'm going to give the whole little paragraph he said. Now it's true that women are still disproportionately affected by this issue, something Michelle always reminds me of. We all laugh, oh, ha, ha. Which is another reason why it's so great that we got to participate. That was an important moment there for us. But which is another reason why it's such great concern for me. Plenty of fathers out there wish they had more time to spend with their kids. Plenty of sons wish they could do more for their elderly parents. Plenty of workers, both women and men, wish they could go back to school so they could beef up their skills and advance their careers. And there are plenty of communities that desperately need the new jobs we can create when we embrace teleworking and mobile workplaces. And I really like that quote because he's talking about men and women, and he's talking about that this is about the economy and it's about jobs. And then he goes on, so let's be clear. Workplace flexibility isn't just a women's issue. It's an issue that affects the well-being of our families and the success of our businesses. It affects the strength of our economy, whether we'll create the workplaces and jobs of the future we need to compete in today's global economy. And so that was very nice. Of course, it came at the very sort of the end of the day. It started off with Michelle Obama speaking and then a panel, and then we all went into these separate rooms, and everybody got their 5 minutes to say something. And this was sort of at the end. But it was really nice to sort of be hit home that these are not just women's issues. So on that, I thought that was, a massive success just in and of itself. The second thing that I really liked about the event was the Council of Economic Advisors did a nice report sort of saying, hey, these things are good for business. And, of course, they used primarily, I think, Sloan-funded research, all this great research out there. And it's great because you can do all the reports in the world, but until it has that special imprimatur of the famous person or the important agency, sometimes people don't listen. So it was fantastic to have them put their seal of approval on it, put that out there. And I want to just give you one factoid from it that I found that was most compelling and I will be using everywhere that I had not heard before. So maybe you haven't either. They talked about a large public utility that temporarily adopted a flexible workplace schedule in one of its subunits while retaining the rest of their normal scheduling in all the other subunits of this public utility. So it was the perfect natural experiment, right? You've got all of these places that are having the same non-flexible schedules, one that has a flexible schedule, and you can see what the outcomes are. So they have this great chart where they show the average absence rates with before this was implemented, during, and then after, because this experiment was only lasted for a year, and then this sub-utility, this thing went back to the normal scheduling. So you've got before, during, and after. And before, the flexible utility and the non-flexible sections of this public utility had about the same number of absence rate days, about 10 days per year. I don't know if that is per person. It didn't say, but so it's about 10. That about the same. During this experiment, the utility that implemented this experimental flexible work schedule, their absence rates dropped by 20%. And the utilities that didn't do it had the same. So they were the same before and during. After, when the sub-utility went back to the regular scheduling, their absence rates jumped right back up to where they had been before. And if that isn't the most compelling evidence for why flexible schedules increase productivity because it reduces absenteeism, I don't know what is. It was so clear, so concise, so perfectly presented. So that was, an A+ on that. So those are a couple of the big things. I want to go over a couple of things that I thought were a little less than awesome about the event. One was they did it on the same day that they announced their offshore drilling plan. So, I got up that morning and I'm super excited about this event. This is like such a big deal for those of us who've been, this is like the peak of a career, right? So excited about this. I flew home early actually from spending time with my family to go to this event. I'm so excited. First thing I hear on the radio is, offshore drilling. It's like, really? Really, today is the day that you're going to announce this? I didn't, and so, watch the news at night, you pick up the New York Times, nothing. There's no coverage. It's like this event never happened. I know there's been some coverage, but really nothing compared to the number of people they got in the room and the vast potential they could have had to have used this massive bully pulpit. So that concerns me a little bit because it seemed like they want to play in this space, but they're not really quite sure that it's as cool as we all think it is. And so that I found disconcerting. The second thing that I found disconcerting is that, little concerning, is that there wasn't a clear sense of what the deliverable was going to be. Right? They brought all these folks together and, it was a great conversation, a lot of business folks, and we know that there's an agenda that they have around these issues, and I'll touch on that in a minute if I don't talk out my time here. But there wasn't a clear sense of what was next. What were they going for? So it was a conversation. It was a first step, and that's fantastic, but there's still a lack of clarity on how much. And so what I keep taking, and we've been having, I know with many of you here in the room, there have been a ton of follow-up meetings with the White House and the Department of Labor, like what's next? What are they going to do? Where are they going to take this? And I keep walking out of each of these meetings going, okay, so we've done a lot of work. Right? There's a ton of fantastic research that shows that these are issues that are important to working families, that they're good for business, they're good for employees, that they're compelling. We have some new polling data that I brought today from the Schreiber report where we looked at how these issues, the policies to address it around flexibility and paid family leave and paid sick days and childcare. They poll off the charts. We've seen this in a number of other polls, but they poll left and right, conservative, liberal. This is on so many levels. It's a no-brainer, and we've got the research. It seems that there's a political moment, but there seems to be this hesitancy. And what I keep taking from these meetings is that they're waiting for still more from our community to show that it's not just the evidence, but there's a political will to put these issues on the table. And I think that's where the disconnect is, or not disconnect, but that's where the challenge is. This morning I was in a meeting with a private company who'd done some polling on millennials. And, they had this, I love these pollsters. They always come in and tell you how to message things, and they always tell you to be concise, and they show up with like 150, slides. But they're fascinating, and they talk for a long time. But they had this one slide that was so great because it asked millennials, what was the most important thing about your job? And 32% said job security. 29% said more money, and 28% said workplace flexibility. And then the next thing was like at 10%. But there it is, right there. It's all, every poll, it's like it's right there. If they ask it, it's up there at the top. And, I can tell you as a statistician, there's probably no statistical difference between the 28% for workplace flexibility and the 31% for job security. It's about the same. So it's right up there at the top of people's agenda. But, I think the question is, what are we going to do to help push the White House and in state houses and in communities around the country to put this on the political map? I mean, it's there, but we haven't sort of done that, kind of pushed it over the edge. So I wanted to end with two things, and I am watching the clock here, just two things. One is that there is a lot of stuff that the administration is doing above and beyond this event. And I think that looking at this event just out of context, it seems a little like, oh, not so. But once you sort of look at it within the basket of the other things that the administration is doing, it really is quite exciting. We at the Center for American Progress, Anna O'Leary and I put out our mapping of what we think needs to happen around these issues. And as we mapped them out, we did this before sort of the White House had done a bunch of things, and it's kind of exciting because we outlined 4 areas where we think they need to work, and there's actually been movement from the administration on all of them. So let me just briefly sort of lay that out. One is that we need to update our basic labor standards, and I appreciate what Mike said about we need to think about the things that we might need to change in our laws, but we also need to add new protections and regulations around basic labor standards, and that includes instituting predictable and flexible workplace schedules. Well, the administration has tasked OPM with doing a pilot program within the OPM's employees to sort of move forward on those issues and to do a demonstration project. That's great. Second is ensuring that workers have access to paid family medical leave. Well, they've put $50 million in their budget for this year to allow states hopefully to experiment with state-based paid family medical leave programs. It's not clear whether or not that'll make it through the process, but they're certainly encouraging that. Establishing the right to paid sick days, we think, is the next thing. And the administration hasn't done much on this, but they say that they really like them. And at the event, the First Lady said, reiterated the administration's support for the Healthy Families Act. The next is, we need to make sure that we're not discriminating against workers with care responsibilities in the workplace. And, one of the things that the administration did, actually that Congress did, but the president just took his magic pen, which was to sign the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, which is a piece of that larger project. And then we also need to make sure that we're doing more, and we haven't talked about this a lot today, but to support the outsourced care that families need to increasingly do because they've got 3 jobs and 2 people. And that would be both around the issues of child care, but also elder care. And it was very exciting to see the president's budget have the largest single-year increase in funding for the child care and development block grants and an increased funding for the child and dependent care tax credit. Say that 10 times fast. They also put in more money for support for elder care. So there's a lot of pieces that they're doing that are above and beyond this event that sort of show that in these various spaces they're willing to play. But they aren't, I think that, there's still a lot of work for us to do and in communities around the country to show them that if you do this, they will be compelled by it. And I think that we have left a lot on the table because we have not, I think we could be doing more to talk about how these are really compelling issues in elections and not to move from a C3 to a C4 conversation. But I think that there's a lot of space out there. These are the things, as an economist, and I'm watching this Great Recession and how it's playing out in families across America. Every poll I read on what's going on, and what are people thinking, they talk about the economy and jobs, jobs, economy. And there's 2 ways of looking at that. And one, you can focus on the 1 in 10 Americans who's out of work right now and is seeking a job and is having an incredibly tough time and just how challenging that is. And we need to, of course, focus on that. But the other piece is this 9 in 10 people who have a job and they're still worried about it. And a lot of it is because of the things Kathleen talked about. They're stressed that if their kid gets sick, they'll lose their job or they'll get a demerit, they won't get that promotion, or that they're not going to be able to make it all work. There are these things that affect people each and every day, and especially for low and moderate income families that don't have the resources to pay for this and to outsource it. They are really struggling with this. And so you see those numbers that people are worried about jobs in the economy, they are worried about what these things that we're talking about here today. And there's a lot more room, I think, to connect that family values issues about what people want, but what's good for the economy, and this basket as being a key and pivotal piece of what we're doing to help middle-class families. And with that, I will end. Thank you.
Thanks, Heather. That was great. And now I'd like to introduce Katie Corrigan from Workplace Flexibility 2010 at Georgetown Law. And as Mike said, has done just a fantastic job of creating bipartisan conversation on this important issue. So, Katie?
Thanks so much, David, for having me again at the New America Foundation. New America has just been a great champion of these issues and really gets these issues in front of different audiences. So I actually don't recognize everyone in the room, which is so refreshing. So again, I'm director of a project at Georgetown Law called Workplace Flexibility 2010, and we are funded by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. So I'm going to stand up straight since my funder is in the front row. I actually wanted to, I'm not sure how many of you actually watched the videotape from the White House Forum, and I wanted to surface a little more of what was said there, and I think actually play out a little more of what Heather started, which is what I perceive as the disconnect that sometimes happens in policy conversations on this issue. So I won't even repeat the quote that the President had said that Heather also just quoted on just how important this issue is for today's economy, which was by far my favorite quote. But the First Lady had said, flexible policies actually make employees more, not less productive. Instead of spending time worrying about what's happening at home, employees have the support and the peace of mind they need to concentrate at work, which is good for their families and for the bottom line. Valerie Jarrett, senior advisor to the President, it's an issue that fundamentally affects all Americans at work and how we live. We believe more workplaces should try to do a better job of meeting the growing needs of their employees and their families. It's not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do for the government and for any company that wants to stay competitive. Dr. Christy Romer, chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. 1/3 of workers say workplace flexibility is the #1 thing they think about in getting a job. And I think actually the numbers in terms of millennials were really striking. So if you're interested in retaining an employee or attracting an employee, it's just absolutely crucial. The Secretary of Labor, Hilda Solis, the bottom line is productivity. And that was just from administration officials. There are 5 breakout sessions populated by lots and lots of different types of companies basically saying the same thing. So this wasn't just the message from the government. This was a message that was also coming out of the breakout sessions that I think was captured by the CEO of Campbell's Soup, who spoke on a panel to open up the event. And he spoke candidly about the proven and positive business results flexibility has brought to his company. He shared that even during the recent recession, Campbell's experienced increased earnings and sales that he credits to the company's commitment to a high trust, high engagement culture, and to flexibility and diversity as core company values. And he went on to say, it's a necessity now. In corporate America, we'll deal with it because it's a necessity and it has to be dealt with. Because we have issues with our workforce and we have issues with attracting, developing, and retaining talent. I think that companies that are in the lead are going to realize benefits, and you just have to pursue it with fierce resolve. Believe me, this wave is going to continue and build on itself because it is undeniable. I found that quite striking. It's undeniable. Corporate Voices for Working Families has a website and different titles of their documents that say it's a business imperative. This is pretty strong language. So I guess it's undeniable unless you're in the House of Representatives that just voted last week. They voted down a bill that would have allowed federal employees more access to telework. So when I heard that, in telework, federal employees, this isn't the biggest piece of legislation moving, but when you have such strong statements coming out of a White House forum and then only 3 weeks later, the House of Representatives voting down a bill, arguably on suspension, so it needed that 2/3 majority, but voting down a bill on telework for federal employees, where you've got all this data showing how great this can be for your bottom line, for your business, which in this case was the federal government, for it to get voted down, when you talk about a disconnect, for me, I wasn't even following that bill because it just seemed like a no-brainer. And I just went, whoa, just telework for federal employees is going down? And the reason given was it costs too much. So I've just spent 5 years learning about how flexibility can be good for the bottom line, can boost productivity, can boost engagement, and then I hear from the Congress, and specifically from the CBO score, that it was going to actually cost money. And they didn't see a return on investment in that CBO score. And then members of Congress voted on that fact. So for me, when I think about what can come out of the White House Forum, I agree with Heather. I think it's still a question of we'll see. But I'm just going to outline 3 areas that I'm hoping the White House Forum can make a difference on. Number 1, these economists, these budget people. I mean, what world are they living in? When I tell people that I was funded by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, they spend all of this money on data that shows there's a mismatch between the structure, people look at me and they're like, okay, Katie, enough, let's get to the meat of it. We know that. We live it. But when I read that CBO score on telework, where they don't even talk about any of the data that you just saw in that nice PowerPoint as a possible return on investment, it makes me have a big question mark, like, wait a second here. Whoever's making these big picture decisions on budget, for example, in the policy world, or inside companies on the bottom line, we still have a long, long ways to go. So I'm particularly excited about that Council of Economic Advisors report, because there is a big difference between me, Katie Corrigan, at WF 2010 saying this is good for companies in the economy, and having Christy Romer say it. So I think that is one area where I'm hoping we can really build out the conversation. And I know that there are still questions on the data, and there are still links to be made in terms of causality in different words that researchers use around how do you show that bang for the buck. You know, there's a really interesting line of data now on the spillover effects on health. Kathleen hinted at that in terms of stress. The NICHD out of NIH is doing a much broader study on this, looking at different types of workers, different types of interventions that can make a difference on health. Well, I think we should be paying attention to that, and those are the types of things that should be factored into any kind of budget score. So I think economists, business bottom line folks, I'm hoping that's one big audience post-White House Forum. The second piece, and this kind of goes from a very inside the Beltway thought to a very outside the Beltway thought. There is a big, huge disconnect between what people want and need and all that polling data that Heather talked about, and how this is perceived inside Washington as not actually a campaign issue. It's striking. I'm looking at Bill Margison, my program associate. Bill has been pulling together news articles on workplace flexibility issues for the past 3.5 years, twice a week. He never has any trouble finding articles. Every Tuesday and every Friday, there are plenty of articles, and again, looking cross-generational. The aging workforce, the millennials, people with small kids, people with older parents, all of this different need around different types of flexibility, and then all of these great stories about companies coming forward and doing this and that type of flexibility, even some policy conversations. But despite all this energy, and we have a very small press shop, and believe me, we would not have any sort of power to generate this kind of press. It just comes up from the ground. But I think one thing that hasn't been done is capture that energy. And that's why one of the slides you saw that Kathleen had done, we spent a lot of time putting a name to this. Workplace flexibility includes these different aspects of flexibility: scheduling, time off, career flexibility. So what's in a name? Well, when the White House did its forum on workplace flexibility, it gave a name to the issue, so that I think we can start capturing some of that energy behind a broad-based movement. And it may not be workplace flexibility at the end. Maybe we'll come up with our own color, green or red or blue, to describe it. But it really is something that is out there in the world, and yet we haven't somehow captured it in the political conversation here in DC. And then finally, I think I'm going to just end, standing behind the first principle of the project that I work on, Workplace Flexibility 2010, which is Hy Feldblum, who was my co-director up until about 3 weeks ago, used to say, this is too big an issue not to be bipartisan. That was sort of where we started. Or if you want to make workplace flexibility the standard of American workplace, that's pretty radical change when you think about it. So when you think about what it would take to move the workplace and to adapt to these new realities, it's not going to be a one-shot solution. There's no one piece of legislation. There's no one perfect business practice. This really does take a big push from multiple sectors. The public sector, so both the federal government and state and locals, the private sector, large companies and small. And again, this is where I feel like there's still an empty box, someone to capture essentially the will of the people. And I feel like that's still where we have a lot of work to do. So those are my 3 takeaways, and I'm going to cut it off so we leave plenty of time for discussion. Thanks.
Just terrific. I'll invite our 4 speakers to come up here if they would, and as we prepare for Q&A. I thought those are just outstanding presentations, and it's as Katie was sort of ending there, it really brings together the importance of different sectors playing in this. And I think it's going to be particularly interesting here just from a Q&A. We have a panel that includes researchers, lawyers, someone from the private sector, economists. There's a variety of expertise and experience here on this issue. And as Katie said, when you have multiple layers now interested in an issue that represents all parts of society now, it has the potential for change. And this is a pretty radical change in the workplace that would from a policy standpoint, but in many ways it would be keep catching up finally to the change of families that we all experience. So I'm going to open it up for question and answer. Danny has a microphone, and we're going to start. When you ask a question, I'd ask you to identify yourself and your organization if you wouldn't mind. Ask it into the microphone so folks watching this on the internet can hear. And be concise in your question if you wouldn't mind. We're going to start. I know we have a number of people from the press here, and we're going to start with any questions from the media. Got one here, and then okay, great.
Hi, I'm with Government Executive Magazine. I cover federal workforce issues. Can you talk a little bit about whether or not there's an opportunity or responsibility for federal agencies to sort of take the lead on work-life balance and telework and other issues?
Okay. Anyone?
Well, actually, I would say that the federal government has taken the lead. It's kind of lost the lead in some ways. But the federal government was really one of the first employers in the United States to adopt the notion of flex time, which was developed in Germany, I guess, in the 1970s. They developed the most comprehensive and even aggressive telecommuting program in the late 80s and the early 90s. And they have always had some agencies that have had very widespread adoption and utilization of flexibility. It has varied a great deal across agencies in terms of utilization. That's why it's so unfortunate that this recent bill didn't pass, because there's a long history of the federal government having actually been a pioneer in many of the forms of flexibility.
I was just going to add, of course, the president at the conference charged head of the OPM, John Berry, to go forward with a series of pilot programs exploring some of these different options, which we think is an extremely positive step and will give some great experience to the rest of the agencies. One of the challenges I often hear from some of our members who are federal contractors that have telecommuting policies, that when they go into the work site and are required to work at the federal government site, they're not allowed to tap into their own company's flexible policies because of the particular rules at the agency they're working at. So that's another area that we think that the federal government could do a great job on in terms of relaxing some of those policies as well.
So we, at Workplace Flexibility 2010, spent a long time taking a look at the federal government and looking at both the law on the books and the policies in practice. And as Kathleen said, we were struck by the fact that the federal government was ahead of its time in the 1970s and unfortunately has fell behind a bit now in the 2000s. But I think that we really felt like the federal government would be a great place to push the envelope. And it does have lots of authority to do pilot projects, which John Berry is in the beginning of exercising his authority to do at least one. Because we felt like one of the questions is, well, how does flexibility work in an hourly setting? How does it work with scientists? How does it work with people that work in state parks? How does it work? There are all these challenges of what Mike raised, which is, different workplaces may need different things. And we thought, well, let's just start testing that out. And we felt the federal government would be a great place to do that. And again, that is why I'm paying very close attention to Congress's perception of whether that is a frivolous exercise that's just a perk, or whether this is actually an important exercise that could give us important data on how best to do policy in this arena.
Great. Right.
And while, let me just, I can, and while I certainly 100% agree with what you all have said, and that the federal government can provide a really important model, there's also, I think, over the past couple of years, there have been some challenges as so many workers have seen their benefits cut, and so many people have been laid off, that there's a bit of a messaging problem that if they're giving more of these kinds of benefits to federal workers, are they sort of overprivileged? And that gets to whether or not we think of these as perks, or whether or not we think of these as bread and butter basic issues that are important to workers and their families. Right. And so it's a real opportunity to say, no, this is the basic standard. It's not a perk. But I think that's been a little bit. It's a challenging time to push through on that message. But I know, the House at least was able to do that on the paid Parental Leave Act that they passed last year, and sort of get through that. So I'm surprised that the telecommuting piece didn't happen.
Yeah, exactly. Another question here, and then
yes.
Gentlemen.
My name is Todd Wiggins, and I'm a blogger under the pseudonym Urban Revival Media. And I wanted to sort of continue that concept or conversation about telecommuting as a subset of workplace flexibility. And I want to ask you a question as it pertains to the Department of Homeland Security. As you may know, there is an initiative to consolidate the Homeland Security headquarters to Southeast D.C. on the old St. Elizabeth's campus. And part of the reason that there's been a need to do that is because DHS is spread out in so many different places. They certainly employ the most advanced telecommunications screens that you can and equipment that you can possibly have, but yet I've heard representatives say, look, there's nothing that can replace people being in front of each other. There's some aspect of communication that's missed when you're talking to someone on a screen, no matter how realistic that is. So is that one example of a good litmus test or petri dish, so to speak, as to how telecommunicating does or doesn't work?
That's a good question. Katie?
Well, I think, first of all, this is exactly the type of conversation that I would like to see in policy in this area, which is, you raise a fair point, it's a fair question. But also, one thing that I think telecommuting can service for us is you do have to manage differently. And one thing that we heard again and again when we ran around the country talking to business was that when we said, well, gosh, there's this great policy in this one department, why hasn't it moved to other departments? Or there's a great policy at the business down the street, why haven't you all adopted it? And we heard, especially actually from HR folks inside companies again and again, that it was about how do you manage this effectively? And I think telecommuting is one of those things where it surfaces it right away, right? The person's not there. So you do have to think about managing differently and training your line managers so they know when someone comes and says, hey, I'd like to telecommute, it's doable for X, Y, or Z reason, they know what to do with that request, and they have confidence that they'd be able to meet the result that that person's getting paid to do, even though they're not physically present.
But, in some ways, I think some managers would say that if you can manage telecommuting, you're just a good manager. Because what's required to be a good manager is to manage results. And that what we're really moving away from in many management cultures is a focus on presenteeism and just managing by FaceTime. And in fact, what oftentimes becomes a problem is when a manager just manages by FaceTime. And they assume because you're there, you're working, when in fact someone may be doing, solitaire. So the reality is many people who both have advocated for telecommuting and also many managers who have nothing to do with managing telecommuters will argue that what really matters is managing for results, wherever your workforce is, present or not present.
And I was going to add, there's another key to this, as important as the frontline supervisor is and participating and buying into this. It's also senior leadership buying into this. It's one thing for folks to establish a policy and have it in place. It's another for it to be used. And that means not only having the support of senior leadership, but having senior leadership actually participate in those types of arrangements. and seeing individuals rewarded either through career advancement or the like for that type of participation. So that's another kind of aspect I think that could be somewhat of a challenge within the structure of the federal government or even in a state government.
Thanks, Mike. All right, so now we open it up for questions from everyone here. We've got a gentleman here, and I see Danny can go around just and pick names. We have questions here and here.
Charter and freelance correspondent, Business Maryland. When Catherine talked, I'm thinking about what's next, so I jumped down. And when Heather talked, he talked about what's next. And two of my four he mentioned. One is, in my word, is our law is behind time. And she says update the standards, so that's the same thing. And then second is this, I say we need to think about our parents. And Karen says think about elder care. Our job you talk about is 3 jobs. Mm-hmm. In my sense, it's 4 jobs because we have our parents and we are sandwich generation. Mm-hmm. So that's and for that I think we need to do something about. In addition to that care, we should have a outdoor daycare center. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very important. Mm-hmm. One time we have 3 kids from 1 to 10, and we have parents. So that's need to think about, and that's quite common too.
Right.
And 2 things he not talk about is wage. Yeah. I think we should nationwide to think about the wage. Yeah, how to maintain at least maintain a level, not going down.
So we've got a focus on the broader care and then on wage here.
Maybe no, there's not more important. Most important is manage. We got to educate the manager, and we should put the one criteria of the performance is how to manage this thing. Yeah. So I think we should talk about those whole thing, so we can move forward. And you talk about the first lady talk. Mm-hmm. Okay, he talk, and president should do it. Yeah. Thank you.
That's a great question. There's a lot in there. I was particularly interested in the piece about how we might look at managers and how managers might be evaluated in terms of how they might manage flexibility. I've been thinking, advocating for OMB. Let's let them answer here a bit.
Teach them about report.
Yeah. Mike, do you have a thought on how managers might be?
No, and again, I kind of mentioned this before, where you're seeing successful workplace flexibility programs not just be offered but adopted, is where organizations are actually taking that in from that management perspective of how you're managing those types of work-life policies in your organization. And being evaluated on that. There is data out there, and I don't remember if Heather produced it or Katie's group or if it was from Catherine's, but when you look at the ROI of companies that actually have workplace flexibility policies, and their bottom line is actually higher. And so, you get right to performance where you're working and looking at the end results and not what happens. It was interesting because I think, Heather, you were in my breakout session of the White House. There was a gentleman that gave he was a consultant and was talking about a major company, Fortune 500 company, that had adopted as part of the work-life program a lactation program, in a lactation room where employees could go in and express milk for their babies. And they came back as part of the report to the board of the organization, about how the employees were adapting to the various different work-life programs that they were offering. And the reports were very positive. The employees loved it. Engagement was up. Absences were down, et cetera. And the CEO, they asked if there was any questions, and the CEO said, yeah, I have one question. He said, where are all the babies in this lactation room? And the CEO thought that mothers were bringing their children to this room to be breastfed. The reason I bring that up is that there is sometimes, again, the importance of it not just being the line manager and participating in these programs, whether it's from an evaluation standpoint or not, but it has to be done just like anything else within an organization. accepted and adopted at the most senior levels of leadership in an organization.
Just to riff on that for a second, we've seen all the research that shows about the productivity enhancements and all of the great stuff that we know has been out there. But I found that one of the most compelling things about the summit, and we were in the same room, was the CEO after CEO who stood up and said, and there was one woman who, to paraphrase, she's like, I'm not doing this because I'm a nice person. I'm doing this because it works, and we did it 20 years ago, and I can't. And it was this very much sort of no nonsense and don't think I'm nice, And I mean, I'm sure she's the head of a Fortune 500 company. Clearly, she's gotten very far in her life, and that probably has helped because she was kind of cute too. So that maybe that was it. But it was really just this sense, and there were so many CEOs in our room that said we did this 15, 20, 25 years ago, and we don't even, it was almost like, why did I have to fly here to tell you all this? I don't understand why people aren't getting it. But one of the things they said, and so that was compelling, it's so compelling if you have a chance to watch the videos, to just hear somebody say that rather than see it in the research. But the other thing that happened in there is that you had CEOs talking about, well, why don't other businesses adopt this? And there was this sense, they're like, well, they don't do it because, I'm in, food production and they're in lollipop production, and it's different. And so there's this very much sort of micro, like really just fine differences in what you manufacture, or you produce, or your service, and somebody else's, and not sure that it's going to work in your workplace, which does get back down to the management issues. And if you think that any manager that gets results is a good manager, but firms think that they're all unique and different and special, I'm not going to get around that. But
well, and one of the things we see, and again, it's not just us saying this, it's some of the research that's come out, is that different approaches work in different environments and that have different challenges. That doesn't mean that a flexible work arrangement can't work in a manufacturing environment and can't work in a construction environment, but it may not. Or it may need to be modified to fit those individual particular needs. But I do think, and we see this across the board in various different HR policies, is organizations tend to think they always have a unique set of circumstances and issues. And it takes, just like any other practice, interesting about the comment from the CEO, she's not doing this because she's nice. They did it because they saw either they had an employee come forward and say, have you thought about this? And then the policy got adopted, particularly 20 years ago, and made the business case for it.
Kathy? Just a second. We'll have follow-ups because there's a number of questions. I'd love to have follow-ups if we have time. I think Kathleen has a comment, and then we've got I saw two more hands.
We're talking about how business fall out on this continuum of adoption of flexibility, and some work that Sloan co-funded with AARP I thought was really interesting. Basically, they fell into three groups. Not surprisingly, there were those who were really early adopters, very gung-ho, really were doing it and really got it. There were those who were opposed to it, just didn't get it, didn't think that there was value to it. They were actually a very small number. The majority of firms were in the middle, and they were the ones who said, in principle, this sounds great. I just don't get it. I don't see how I'm going to make it work. And what was really clear as we listened to many of the comments made by these managers and owners of the firms is that there is in many ways a poverty of imagination. People are very used to doing business in the way they've done it in the past. They can't imagine doing it in a different way. And at times they can't imagine even being open to a conversation where the workforce comes in and said, have we thought about restructuring the way the production line works? Have we thought about restructuring the way the workday is structured so that we can do it? And in fact, when you go to the employees, as we saw on a demonstration project that we had supported at Chubb, they found that by going to flexibility negotiated on a team basis as opposed to an individual basis, they were able to do compressed work weeks for almost everyone on the team, and by doing that, they extended the day. So people who normally would never want to take overtime ended up saying, well, I'd really rather get up later and work longer, and so their overtime costs went down. So the employees got the flexibility they wanted. the employer got the cost savings they desired, and it all came from really listening to one another. And I'm not trying to be Pollyannish, but I do think there has to be an element of imagination in this and openness that seems to be what's lacking in a lot of firms, because, and particularly in this economy, there is such difficult circumstances for so many firms. This is probably not what they're thinking, but in fact, if they were, they might in fact see that there could be some dollar savings and dollar gains.
Right. Very good. All right, I saw two hands back here, and we've got a question here as well. So Danny, why don't you?
I'm Ariane Higovish from Institute for Women's Policy Research. Firstly, very briefly, thank you so much for organizing this. It's wonderful to be here and Cassie's work. I wanted to ask a question. In policy terms, in Washington, people are starting to focus on healthcare costs and insurance costs, and there's great research showing how flexible working can help reduce those costs. But I wanted to ask about the boundaries, really, between work and non-work, and what the role is to setting those. Don't know whether you heard this morning, there's new research from, I think, the UK. People who work systematic overtimes are much more likely to get heart attack. I just read something that CEOs expect over the next 10 years that 90% of them, I think, that it will be more likely that employees will be contacted during their vacation. The work that Workforce 2010 has done puts a lot of emphasis also on the need for predictability of hours and limits. So I just wondered how you feel those two fit together in the discussion.
Thanks, sorry.
I just want to start off with one quick, because I hear you on that, Ariane. I think I'm so glad you brought up that question. And one of the other things that I found slightly disconcerting about the president's statements on March 31st was talking about that he didn't want a snowstorm to ever close the federal government again. And I can appreciate that, but he wants people to be able to telecommute. I can totally appreciate that, but then if your kids aren't in school, then that does pose real challenges for families, and it does pose this, like, there's no sort of get out of jail free card, and sometimes a snow day can be a good thing for a family. So I'm really glad you brought it up, but I'll let some of my colleagues up here.
Well, I was going to say, one of the challenges, I think, is being able to figure out where those time frames start and stop, and that's even part of the challenge with how it interacts with federal law. For example, an hourly employee and when they're eligible for overtime and not, when their workday stops. Because, the people younger than me, they're thinking nothing about checking their BlackBerry at 11 o'clock at night. Well, that's compensable time. And they may have been off the clock for a while. A lot of the studies I've seen about, particularly with telecommuting and particularly with exempt employees, is they work more because it's there and it's easier to do, and they're more engaged for whatever reason. I'm not saying that's the reason to do it. Don't get me wrong, or not to do it, but that is a challenge, particularly in this environment where we're never out of touch with our electronic devices and the like. Is how do you do that?
I'm very glad that you brought that up, and I think, one way of looking at it is, in terms of public policy, the role is to get more flexibility, right? Like, there's this kind of how do you step on the gas and get us to go faster? And I think the other role of public policy, though, is also to put the brakes on and to define the rules of the road. And when you get to a curve, and your kid is home sick, what happens then? So I think that policy, again, the way we've been trying to approach it is there's a bunch of different levers. Sometimes it's going to be trying to make something go faster, and sometimes I think it's going to try and put the brakes on a little so that we can slow down. And I've been trying to come up with metaphors on this, so I'm testing that one out. Because I think one of the divides that we've encountered in terms of our conversations with business, and again, we came into this 6 years ago and actually we're very strict on our policy of rigorous neutrality. We didn't have a position on public policy for years and years because we really were trying to hear both sides. We were trying to hear, and we were also trying to talk. And one of the things that I found most difficult in talking with business was really coming up with a language, a metaphor, a way of discussing this that mirrored what I think is a very rich conversation, as opposed to devolving into yes, no, us, them, mandate, no mandate. So I just I'm glad for your question, because it gives me an opportunity to make the point, which is I do feel like we need to come up with language, a way of talking, a room for conversation, metaphorically, that allows us to say, okay, sometimes, yes, let's step on the gas using this particular tool or not. But other times, we need to hit the brakes. So how do we do that? And, this is where I think, by the end of the year, we're going to have a pretty rich set of policy recommendations that look at the range of ways of doing it, all the way from a requirement on down to incentives and pilot programs. But it's because we feel like you need that full toolkit, in a sense, to get at the different issues as you go forward.
I guess my comment would be more from the private sector side. Flexibility in a culture of overwork is a real challenge, and it was never brought home more clearly to me than once when a CEO said about his general counsel, well, she can work her 80 hours whenever she wants to. That's not what I think any of us are talking about. And so let me emphasize flexibility in a culture of overwork. What's got to change in those cases isn't the flexibility, it's the culture. And some of the firms really have addressed this issue of culture of overwork very clearly, and the need for some boundaries. So I think of Ernst & Young, where they really tried to put into place a culture in which people didn't necessarily travel on a Sunday and come back on a Friday. If they were going to a client, they would go out on a Monday and come back on a Thursday night. And it was really driven by what the employees were saying they wanted for their family life. Mm-hmm. Also the fact that they would not have emails going out all over the weekend. The culture was you didn't have to answer your manager within 20 minutes whenever he or she sent you an email. So I think and there's a really interesting article in the Harvard Business Review by Leslie Perlow last October about Boston Consulting, where they've tried to deal with the culture of overwork and how you deal with time in that culture. So I think that in the private sector, where efforts have to be made is looking at the culture and not using flexibility as a way to really allow a culture to run amok, to just, even go further into long hours.
Right. All right, given time, we're going to start doubling up on questions if we could. We're going to take 2 questions at a time and let our panel answer those. Let's raise your hand if you've got a question as we think through where we are here. All right, we should be okay here.
Hi, I'm sorry. Laura Iyama, freelancer for 51%. It's a women's radio program. I actually have 2 questions. One of them was along the lines of, you mentioned that Germany has had flex time for some time. Are other countries also adopting flex time? Are we behind other countries in comparison to them? And is the data clear enough from the other countries that someone could argue that's the case, that the U.S. should adopt this? And the other question I would have is more in terms of the political aspect. A lot of times people do take these polls and they test out what terms will work in political campaigns. And I would assume, maybe it is a broad assumption, but a lot of times these sorts of family issues don't, on the abstract, people talk, I'm pro-family, I'm for the family, and then you look at the policies that they adopt and you say, well, actually, I don't think that really is true. But you can say that, and just saying the word works. And you look at the Family and Medical Leave Act, I don't think anyone gained votes from having voted for an unpaid family medical leave. No, I don't think there's any polling that shows that it helped anybody. So when you look at the political campaigns, I don't think this is one of those political issues which will work.
Right. All right, let's take a second question. I saw a second hand here.
Hi, Phil Fleming, retired lawyer. A suggestion for Katie and perhaps others. If you're not familiar with the model of the Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, they have worked out a progressive scheme where they enlist Washington law firms, where overwork is legendary, to volunteer pro bono time to work on cases in their ambit. And it seems to me, as you think about statutory and regulatory changes to make flexibility a reality, picking up on that model might work, because there's no place that should be more interested as a matter of self-interest than Washington law firms to do this work.
Great. Did I see any other hands for questions? Straight on. All right, let's take these questions that we have. We have a flex time in other countries, political data, and the pro-family, and the Washington lawyer piece. You want to jump into any of that mix?
I'll just start with that last one. I
right,
just wrote that down. I think that's a great suggestion. And I also want to acknowledge Joan Williams' work out of the Work Life Institute at Hastings Law School has also worked with law firm culture and has some really good studies and examples of how law firms have have changed that culture and really had to actually look at their business model in terms of the billing cycles. So, but thank you. I'll look at that more specifically.
Go on, just given time, and have each of our speakers have a last word on trying to answer these questions, and then as they sum up about where we go from here. Katie, any last word as we go?
No, I mean, I think in terms of the international issues, I'm looking, Ariane Hegezwich is sitting in the audience,
Right.
and I always feel a little foolish talking about international law when she's sitting there, but there is a lot to look at in Europe. We have also spent a lot of time looking at what's happened in Australia. In some ways, I think, and I'm also sitting in front of Bob Drago, who's an Australia expert, but I'll do a modest version. In Australia, I found them quite interesting because in some ways, the way their government is structured and some of the tensions between whoever's in power and the opposition. So sometimes it's the conservatives in power and the opposition, sometimes liberals in power with the opposition. There have been different takes on these issues. And when the conservative government was in power, they shied away from requirements, but they didn't shy away from the issue. They did a lot of promoting the importance of these issues, particularly around caregiving. They did a lot of looking at what does flexibility look like in the context of the restaurant industry, for example, which I think has traditionally been thought of as a tough industry. So even there seemed to be some government buy-in cross-party that this is an important set of issues to grapple with. Granted, each party had some different ideas of how to get there. And most recently, in addition to some of the maternity leave, they've also looked at a right to request and just last year passed it. So I think the law just started tolling in the beginning of January. So I think we'll have some interesting data about how that's working out for Australian companies, sometime in the next 6 months to a year.
Thanks, Katie. Heather?
Yeah, I mean, I think your question, I'll take the one about politics. I think your question is quite apt, whether or not people actually vote on these issues. I think that there's two challenges there. I mean, one is how they're framed and talked about. And I think that, the Family Medical Leave Act is a good example, but that was in 1993, which was, as far as I can tell, a really long time ago, and a lot has changed for families between now and then. So I think that there does appear to be more of a bubbling up. And also, I mean, I think what's interesting about this basket of issues, unlike a lot of other policy areas, is there is no magic bullet. There isn't it's not one piece of legislation. It's not like, in the climate stuff or energy, it's like it's all about this one climate bill, or, the financial reg, it's like this one bill. Here it's like there's like 22 different things that we need to do. And I think I haven't seen a lot of folks take up that full mandate, that this is about the job security for the middle class, this is about family values, this is about a basket of issues around labor and our economy. I mean, I think that there's an openness there that I haven't seen a lot of folks pick up on. So I don't know that we have a lot of evidence that if you sort of put this in that broader basket, that it wouldn't be quite compelling.
Thank you, Heather. Mike?
Well, just to add a little bit to Heather's comment, I do think it's a tough issue on both sides, particularly the climate. You just had the climate we have right now in Washington, an unemployment rate of 9.9%. We just passed comprehensive health care reform. There's other aspects from an employment situation from most employers' perspective. When you start talking about things like the Healthy Families Act or paid FMLA, they look at it as a potential economic hit and from a mandate perspective. There is a proposal actually out there that's gotten some, at least bipartisan support on the House side, which is the Workplace Life Award, which was co-sponsored, or co-developed, I should say, bipartisanly by Congresswoman Woolsey, I'm sorry, and McMorris Rogers, in which employers would be recognized for various different types of work-life programs. Again, is another way to try and encourage that dialogue going further. And to somebody else that Heather intimated about in her earlier comments, there's a lot of work that can be done short of legislation too. The agencies could do a lot. We talked about some of the pilot programs. There could be other types of best practice or effective practice information that could be put out. So until the political will does get built up to address that type of an issue, the ball could still go forward in some of these other areas.
Thanks, Mike. Kathleen?
I guess my comment would go to the gentleman's comment about the one example with regard to the lawyers. I think that where we are now, companies have to really learn from each other. I mean, as policy begins to move, as the political will begins to move, we're still in a position where companies are trying to figure out what's going to work for them. And so to that extent, because I don't think it's been fully mentioned, Mike alluded to it, I would say that I would encourage people to look at Families and Work Institute's Guide to Bold New Ideas. They administer the Sloan Awards for Business Excellence and Workplace Flexibility in 30 communities around the country. 1,000 companies have won. These are companies that have really grappled with this issue of how do you make work for that company and that environment with those workers. And Patricia Kempthorne from Twiga works with When Work Works. And I think it's important to understand that there are so many different models, and the one-size-fits-all workplace doesn't work anymore, but the one-size-fits-all flexibility doesn't work either. And not all employers are even calling it flexibility. I mean, that's something else. I think that the language is the best language we have now. I've really felt it's a language that's going to take us from here to there. We're figuring out what there is. And by the time we get there, that language may not be either necessary. It will just be the way it is. But right now, it's what we've got.
Great. Thanks, Kathleen. Yeah. All right, it's 1:45, and I want to wrap up here with just ask you to join me in thanking our 4 speakers today. Just terrific. Thank you as well to the Sloan Foundation. Yes, well, I appreciate it. And thank you to everyone for being here today. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon. We are adjourned.